I would like to introduce our final panel, which will be moderated by Ambassador Ronald Lehman II. Ambassador Lehman is counselor to the director of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He chairs the Defense Threat Reduction Advisory Committee for the Department of Defense and chairs the governing board of the International Science and Technology Center at the Department of State. Ambassador Lehman was director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency from 1989 to 1993, when START I, START II, the Chemical Weapons Convention, Conventional Forces in Europe, Open Skies, and other historical agreements were concluded. He has previously served at the Department of Defense as Assistant Secretary for International Security Policy, Ambassador and Chief Negotiator for START I at the Department of State, and Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs at the White House. He has also served in the National Security Council as Senior Director, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Pentagon, and Senior Professional Staff on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Ambassador Lehman was commissioned in the United States Army in Vietnam, and in past years has served in the Presidential Advisory Group, governing board of the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the U.S. representative to a number of United Nations disarmament and review conferences. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Ronald Lehman and the panelists for Panel 7.
Thank you. I want to welcome everyone to the long-awaited arms control panel. I hope that you anticipate it because of the substance, but I know we're also the last of 7 panels, but I assure you we aren't the last word. Admiral Creedy gets that. Our panel members have been asked to address whether mutual arms restraint in today's multipolar world is still possible. And if so, how might it differ from the earlier arms control at the end of the Cold War? With Alexandra, Vince, Ryan, and Brian, we are guaranteed an interesting panel. They will offer some analysis and even some initiatives. And I think they are going to challenge some of the assumptions behind a number of the questions that have been raised and some statements that have been made. I would be pleased to offer a few assumptions myself, but my role is basically to be the moderator or, as necessary, the provocateur to make sure that we have an interesting discussion. What I will do, though, is if we're going to use the arms control at the end of the Cold War as something of a benchmark or a contrast to look at where we are today, I'd like to remind everyone of what all happened in those days. So much happened that it's going to be just a bunch of names dropped. The SS-20, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the SALT II Treaty, anthrax in Sverdlovsk, Zapad 81 and the Polish crisis, the NATO deployment of the Pershing II and the ground-launched cruise missiles, the Soviet walkout from INF START and MBFR, the Krasnoyarsk radar, the return to INF and START talks, and the addition of defense and space talks, the Chernobyl nuclear power accident, the Stockholm Agreement on confidence and security building measures in Europe, the upgraded Washington-Moscow hotline, and the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center is established, the INF Treaty, the joint verification experiments, and the other fly-before-buy bilateral experiments in nuclear and chemical arms control verification, the dismantlement of the Krasnoyarsk radar, the verification protocols that led the United States Senate to ratify the Threshold Test Ban Treaty 98-0, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the 2+4 agreement on Germany and German forces, the Treaty on Conventional Forces, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, Desert Storm, and the coalition to expel Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait, the discovery of the Iraqi WMD program, and the United States Special Commission on Iraq, UNSCOM, the IAEA additional protocol push, the START I Treaty with its bomber discount rule and its tight limits on fast flyers and heavy ICBMs, and its structure designed to promote diversity for stability, the strategic stability talks with the Soviets, the coup against Gorbachev, the presidential nuclear initiatives, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, The withdrawal of the Cubans from southern Africa, the end of apartheid, and South Africa giving up its nuclear weapons. The Lisbon Agreement, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine also giving up nuclear weapons. The conversion of the bilateral START I and ABM treaties to multilateral treaties. North Korea's finally concluding an IAEA safeguards agreement. The North-South denuclearization agreement, in which both Seoul and Pyongyang gave up the right to both enrichment and reprocessing. The first summit at the head of state level, head of government level, of the United Nations Security Council, at which UK Prime Minister John Major made the statement on behalf of all of the participants that any further nuclear proliferation would be seen as a threat to international security, and which is code word for strong actions to follow. China and France finally joined the NPT. A series of joint combating WMD programs, such as the Cooperative Threat Reduction programs and the embedded engagement of things like the science centers. The U.S.-Russian discussions on cooperation in missile defense. START II, which banned MIRVed ICBMs, and it had a special limit on other fast flyers such as SLBMs. It also banned heavy ICBMs. The Open Skies Treaty and the Chemical Weapons Convention. Well, I think I've prompted many of you to have fond memories and others of you to ask, what the hell is that all about? I think my own view on the revolution in arms control that took place at the end of the Cold War would take far more time than I have in an introduction. I also have my views on how we ended up in the sort of hollowed out, pale reflection of the regime that we have today. But more importantly, I think we need to think about what's changed geostrategically and with technology and what it means. But I'm going to leave that to the panel members to discuss. But I should make at least a few provocative statements, so I will do so. First, the end of the Cold War began before the end of the Cold War, and it's traceable in the arms control record. Second, arms control has provided many different tools for cooperation, but they are also arenas for competition, and in some cases they've actually been weaponized. Third, that nuclear arms control's most dramatic effects are often indirect, and just as they shape deterrence and defense and diplomacy and economic and political development, and they are influenced by them. Fourth, I think the most effective agreements, in my experience, have been those that go beyond the norms to actually shape behavior. And often that is best done by a step-by-step practical process of solving real concrete issues facing the various parties. Fifth, I'd like to point out that with the end of the Cold War, the interest in all of the intrusive and burdensome inspections and regimes was reduced. They were seen as less necessary, but now we're living in a world where it may be much harder to get back to any kind of intrusiveness and transparency of the sort that we once thought was possible. And this is made more complex in part by political developments around the world that you've heard a number of people discuss, but also by technology that offers us what I call the Manichaean problem. On the one hand, when you look at social developments and technology, you see the possibility of having almost total situational awareness and immediate and accurate connectivity. On the other hand, many of the same social and technological developments give you the opposite of lightness, which is darkness, which is the ability to shut down knowledge and to deny connectivity and communications among necessary groups and peoples. But then there's a third situation, which a number of people also alluded to, which is in the middle, which is the potential to use these technologies and social forces to create misinformation and indeed a totally false sense of what is real. These are only some of the challenges that technology and social change are going to create for arms control. But finally, just one point on nuclear, since that was the key decision. I like to remind everybody that in all of the nuclear arms control agreements that were limiting forces, the limits on nuclear weapons, by that I mean the explosive devices that are in stockpiles, were all indirect. We use surrogate measures. We, in fact, have never, ever figured out how to go deal with the actual explosive devices themselves. That has been a real challenge, and it will continue to be a real challenge. So at that point, I hope I've provoked everyone, and now I call upon the panel members to be even more provocative. So let us begin with Rear Admiral Ryan Scholl, Deputy Director for Plans and Policy at STRATCOM. Ryan?
Thank you, Ambassador Lehman. I want to just say that I'm excited and honored to be here. This is my second Deterrence Symposium, and it's great to see some friends and familiar faces out in the crowd. I will say, as a Deterrence Symposium, though, this brings temperate weather to Omaha for the second time that I've been here, so don't expect this all the time. I guess we deter the real heat as we come. But I wanted to focus, from my perspective, on a plans and operations side to arms control. I have 30 years of operational background in the Navy, none of which, well, very little, I guess, would be nuclear in nature. So as I come, this has been a campaign of learning for me in the last 14 months with regard to our missions at Strategic Command. So I'll stay in that swim lane first. I would say that we are trained, ready, and postured for all the threats that exist today. Our combat-ready forces, our nuclear capabilities provide the strategic deterrence, preventing nuclear attacks on the United States, our allies, and our partners, and that is guaranteeing our national and allied security. Now I'm looking to the camera because I know it's streaming, but I want to go from big to small in the discussion. So the strategic deterrence that's assigned to U.S. Strategic Command through our Unified Command Plan is arguably the most important of the missions. As the Deputy Director for Plans and Policy, then my job really is to plan, advise policy, operationalize strategic deterrence, provide assurance to our allies, and then be prepared to execute operations and actions in support of our national objectives. That has to be in accordance with our nuclear policy, as well as in coordination with our other combatant commands. All right, this deterrence strategy then relies on broad as well as detailed understanding of the strategic environment. From a numbers perspective, we have to have a thorough knowledge of an adversary's forces, their assets, their capabilities, as well as their vulnerabilities. From a less tangible side, we need to understand their perceptions to benefits, costs, their consequences of action, and the consequences of restraint that they see and that they perceive. It's a collaborative effort across the Directorates of Strategic Command, across the combatant commands, across our governmental agencies, and indeed with our allies. And this is one of the many venues that we have to be able to talk and discuss what that would be and what that means in terms of our allies, our actions, and what we do to deter. Now, I will then focus in on, if you're wondering when I was going to get to the panel topic of arms control, I'll start here. So the broad and detailed understanding of the strategic environment includes our understanding of arms control and the status of arms control regimes and agreements so that we can advise the commander of U.S. Strategic Command on the impacts to any changes and the status of arms control and how that affects our plans. We work together with services, we work together with our component commands to meet treaty central limits and understand and define the numbers of strategic offensive arms. This informs our planners what we have available to be able to execute our deterrence mission. Inside the nuclear posture review, and I'm going to paraphrase, but roughly quoting, arms control can contribute to U.S. security by helping manage strategic competition among states. It fosters transparency, understanding, predictability in adversary relations, thereby reducing the risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation. My words would be strategic stability. Inside of an earlier testimony this year, General Hyten stated that he wants our country to be in a strategic arms reduction treaty with our adversaries, Russia in particular. First, because it puts a limit on strategic offensive arms, the numbers game. But I also believe that he stated later that he wants it to encompass all of Russia's strategic arms. Second, and why it's important to have that, is that it also provides a verification regime. Okay, this verification regime is a huge value in that it allows us to see what Russia is doing with their strategic weapons, and likewise, it provides, when they come, it provides them insight into our compliance, our activities, and our capabilities. So from an operational standpoint, they get to see the strength of the U.S. So when anybody sees it, but particularly our adversaries, they get to see the capabilities, the readiness, the professionalism, and strength of our strategic forces. Super powerful strategic message to be able to see what your competitor is doing on a daily basis with forces that contribute to that strategic stability. I will say that compliant and effective arms control contributes to our overall strategic deterrence. Inside of traditionally, it puts limits on the types and numbers of strategic arms, but as General Hyten stated, only in that it encompasses all of the strategic arms. Secondly, an effective verification process is a transparency tool. That transparency tool allows both sides to gain visibility into the other's capabilities. Verification inspections show to the other party just how capable the forces really are, and that contributes to the credibility of that capability. That sits inside the 3 C's of deterrence: capability, credibility, and inside of these inspections, it is a way and a shape and a form of communication to our adversary exactly what we have and the capacity and capability to execute it, which encourages restraint from both parties for fear of standard deterrence theory, which is cost imposition. Now, as I close, I want to change around the venue just a bit. And from my perspective, ask a question not to be answered today, but to be a thought process for development of theory as we look towards future arms control agreements. And so I'll ask a question, making a baseline assumption that we go into agreements with rational actors. Those rational actors have a vested interest to be in that agreement, to participate and be compliant. So in that I say, as we look at what we had previously and what we are looking to get to tomorrow, we have opaque societies or some level of opaqueness inside of those societies that we want to come into agreements with. And when we see transparency inside those societies, we are met with a campaign of disinformation. That disinformation campaign leads to ambiguities and misunderstandings. So then my question would be, how do you create effective and enforceable verification regimes inside of the 21st century? How do we do that going forward so that we have an understanding that leads to the things that allow operators, planners, and folks that sit in strategic command inside of the J5 and other directorates to be effective in terms of our planning, to have predictability and understanding so that we provide strategic stability to our nation and our allies. I'm still excited to answer some of your questions, and I thank you all.
Thank you, Ryan. Our next speaker is Vince Manzo, who is a research scientist at CNA. Vince?
Thank you very much, and I want to extend my thanks to Strategic Command for 2 days of excellent discussion. I think this is my 5th Deterrence Symposium, and I know the first one I came to was the summer of 2010. I was thinking back about those 2 days, and one of the themes that the conference illustrated really well for me was that deterrence and arms control are 2 tools that should work in concert with each other. They should be self-reinforcing and part of a comprehensive strategy for reducing nuclear dangers and nuclear risks. And I think that's still the case today, but as we all know, there's a very different strategic context that we find ourselves in now than back in 2010, and trying to understand how we utilize these two tools in concert to address the threats we face now and that are emerging, I think is a tough analytical challenge that we all should spend some time really trying to work through. And this panel has given us some good questions to help us think that challenge through. So I'm going to address the question, is a formal arms control agreement necessary, or can voluntary agreements serve our security needs? And I think by formal arms control agreement, it means legally binding and ratified treaties versus something that's less formal, maybe not legally binding. And I'll give you my bottom line up front is really that it depends. I can give you cases where I think legally binding agreements are the most effective. Non-legally binding ones would be less effective, but certainly better than no cooperation at all. And the example I'll walk through is numeric limits on nuclear weapons. But I can also think of cases where non-binding arms control agreements might actually be more effective. And the example I'm going to walk through, and I'm still thinking through myself, is conduct-based arms control, where you're focusing more on actions rather than the weapons themselves. So more on how you might use the weapons versus how many you have. So I'll start with the New START Treaty and sort of how you might handle this in a verifiable way or a legally binding way versus a non-legally binding way. So at my research organization, CNA, we recently released a study doing a scenario-based analysis looking at what happens if the New START Treaty expires with nothing to replace it, what are the risks of that world, and what are some non-treaty-based policy options for managing them. And I'm going to kind of go through that a little bit here. So for example, imagine we're in a scenario where New START expires. The United States and Russia are perhaps in the process of negotiating another treaty, but they haven't gotten there yet. What are some options that we might have for non-formal or informal arms control under those conditions? Well, both countries could pledge to independently stay at New START limits while they work towards another agreement. And they could even try to emulate some of New START's transparency provisions outside of a treaty framework. So how might that work? Well, under New START, both sides, for instance, provide biannual data exchanges on the number of warheads deployed across each type of delivery vehicle and the number of warheads deployed on each delivery vehicle at each declared missile base. Right? They exchange this information on a confidential basis. It's not in the public domain, but both countries have it, and it's part of their sort of data set for their operational understanding of the other's strategic posture. So could we continue to do this without a treaty? Well, the answer is mixed. We could continue to try and provide information to each other about deployed warheads outside of a treaty. They could continue providing those notifications on a biannual basis. And you could even think of a way to try and improve each country's confidence in those declarations by providing the notifications about changes in deployed warheads before they happen, right? So rather than doing it after the fact, you do it beforehand, giving both sides the ability and the time to potentially position their national technical means of intelligence gathering and observe some of the activity that would be observable associated with, for instance, putting more warheads out at Minot Air Force Base or taking warheads away from that area. So that would be valuable. It would be a case of informal arms control that I think would serve both countries' interests, but it wouldn't be that easy. So the first and foremost, there would be a legal challenge to sharing that information outside of a treaty framework. Without a treaty, it would actually require amending the Atomic Energy Act in order to share information about the numbers and locations of deployed nuclear warheads. So that would be a big challenge. However, there are some steps that would be valuable and not quite as difficult. So as many of you know, under New START, both sides provide notification about the status of missiles and launchers, whether they're deployed or non-deployed, where they are, when they go into maintenance. Without a treaty, the United States and Russia could continue this practice, and again, maybe even enhance it by providing those notifications before the changes are made, which again would allow each side to potentially observe some of those movements with national technical means. And unlike warheads, sharing this information related solely to the delivery vehicles would not require an act of Congress. The president could simply do so as a matter of policy. And for instance, under New START, the United States and Russia provide 48-hour notification before additional ballistic missiles leave their production facilities. Again, we could continue doing that without a treaty. So there are options, but my bottom line after looking at this and studying it and trying to think it through was that the regime for transparency without a treaty would not provide as wide and as clear as a window into each other's strategic postures as we get under the New START treaty. Now, it would certainly be a better window than either could get with no cooperation at all, so that's important. The frame of reference matters here. But ultimately, my sense is that if our goal is to try and have predictability through numeric limits on nuclear forces and numeric limits that we have some verification regime and some confidence that the other side is complying with the limits, the legally binding treaties remain the gold standard for filling that goal. And I would be real hesitant to lose that if we can avoid it. So I'm going to move from what we consider more traditional arms control now just to wrap up on this concept of conduct-based arms control. So I can imagine some threats for which informal arms control cooperation might be more effective. So conduct-based arms control would really focus more on building a shared understanding about the consequences of actions rather than the numbers and types of weapon systems, or at least how many you have and maybe where you're deploying them. So at a minimum, conduct-based arms control, I think, would aim to ensure that U.S., Russian, and Chinese officials understand how each other would perceive and consider responding to the posturing, operation, and use of certain types of weapons. So I think this might be applicable to cyber operations. I think it might be applicable to space and counterspace, and to nuclear forces. So I think optimally, this model of arms control would culminate with shared inhibitions on certain types of decisions and actions, such as the first use of nuclear weapons, cyber operations against critical infrastructure, perhaps some space operations such as kinetic anti-satellite tests. And just as importantly, it's not so much that each country would agree to never do these things, but they would come away with greater clarity and understanding on the conditions and variables that underlie each country's strategy planning and decision making. So you're getting a form of predictability there, but it's very different than the type of predictability that we associate with the New START Treaty, for instance. So I'll give one example of where I think conduct-based arms control would be valuable, but I'll admit my thinking's still in the early stages. I certainly don't have a clear, definitive solution yet, but it's something I'm wrestling with. I think conduct-based arms control to reestablish that both the United States and Russia have an exceedingly strong inhibition on using nuclear weapons first in a conflict would be very valuable. And I think the starting point for this, at least in my view, before you get to kind of declarative statements or even non-binding agreements, is really a structured official dialogue between U.S. and Russian officials, which again is not a new idea, but I think if it's done the right way, it could be very valuable. So given the state of things in U.S.-Russian relations now, particularly on this topic, I think a working level dialogue where you have Russian officials explain their nuclear strategy and force structure, including their theater range or non-strategic nuclear force structure. And then you have U.S. officials explain their interpretation of Russian strategy and force structure, and the U.S. counter strategy, our nuclear deterrence strategy, would be a really good starting point. And I think first few meetings would probably involve a fair amount of posturing and talking points. But if you continue to do it and you did it at the expert level, I think it could be the basis of a fruitful conversation. And at a minimum, I think hopefully both sides at least come out with confidence that they have communicated their views, the other side understands their views, and hopefully they have a little better clarity on the other side's strategy as well. So that's one early example of conduct-based arms control. One final point on that is I think it would be important to scope these discussions so that you're not trying to talk about everything under the sun in these meetings. But I think you would want to discuss nuclear and non-nuclear strategic forces and the plans and concepts, at least at a conceptual level, for how we think about utilizing these systems. There's been a lot of good research that tells us that actions with non-nuclear capabilities could play a major role in a country considering crossing the nuclear threshold. So I think scoping them in the right way would be really valuable. And I guess my final point is I just want to acknowledge that there is a real tension here, and that's something I think about quite a bit, which is we want to have a strong inhibition on the first use of nuclear weapons between the United States, between Russia, with China. But we also want leaders in each of these countries to acknowledge that in any major power conflict, there would be an incalculable risk of nuclear escalation. So in other words, it would be destabilizing if US, Russian, and Chinese officials all believed that they could fight a war against each other and there was no risk of nuclear escalation. So there is a tension there, and I think that just illustrates that reality is messy, and it illuminates a broader point that as we do enter this era of strategic competition, and I think we've talked a lot about the national defense strategy. In my view, the most important part about the national defense strategy was that it characterized the relationship with Russia and the relationship with China, and acknowledged that there is a big competitive dimension there. Doesn't mean it's all competition. There are common interests, but I think we have to acknowledge that we don't have the partnerships we hoped we would have maybe back in 2009 and 2010. And our attempt to think about arms control cooperation in this context has to sort of understand that competitive dynamic. But I think we also have to think about the value of competition or cooperation as we manage this competition, and how we set boundaries and boundaries, limits, and restraint, because we don't, for many, many reasons, fiscal, diplomatic, strategic, military, we do not want unbounded competitions with either of these countries. And so again, thinking about how you utilize these two tools of deterrence and arms control in a contemporary context is something that is worthy of a lot of thought and needs a lot of thought. So I look forward to discussing that with everyone.
Thank you very much, Vince. Our next speaker is Alexandra Bell. She's the Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. Alexandra?
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. It's a real honor to be here. I'll admit I'm going to come from this sort of a practitioner standpoint as opposed to an academic one. And the answer to the framing question for this panel about areas for arms control in the 21st century, the answer is emphatically yes. Mutual restraint through verifiable arms control measures is in the interest of this nation and every nation in the world. The second part of that answer is that arms control has never just been about nuclear weapons. The first arms control treaty of the Cold War era was actually an Arctic treaty, which banned military activity on that entire continent. In subsequent years, as the ambassador kind of went through, we created arms control agreements to constrain chemical and biological weapons, as well as conventional arms control treaties in Europe, most recently an arms trade treaty aimed at regulating international trade in conventional weapons. So there are all sorts of ways you can apply arms control, not just to nuclear weapons. That's increasingly important as we sort of see threats coming from multiple domains. Arms control is a tool that we can use to shape and adapt to fit our needs. And that's true of the work that lies ahead. Of course, I'm under no illusion, and I don't think anyone in this room is either, that the state of strategic arms control right now it's pretty terrible. And that's not a reason to despair or stop working or assume that we can't change the current conditions. Arms control is hard, as Vince mentioned. It's messy. Building trust is hard. Dealing with countries that don't view the world in the same way we do is hard, but it's all a lot easier than dealing with the aftermath of a potential nuclear conflict. So knowing we're in the bad place, what specifically can we be doing to strengthen the existing arms control agreements that we have and build future ones? First, we take advantage of the opportunities in front of us. The INF Treaty will collapse tomorrow. When it does, New START will be the last standing bilateral arms control treaty between the United States and Russia. Extension is just common sense from a security perspective. New START is working. It's providing the predictability and stability we need for proper planning of our own forces. We cannot buy the kind of intel that we get from 18 on-the-ground inspections a year, literally thousands upon thousands of data exchanges. Literally cannot buy it, even if we tried and did divert the time, the energy, the resources into something that we were previously getting for free. It wouldn't be as good. Some people have put forward the idea that we need to bring other systems or other countries under New START, and perhaps New START extension could be a bargaining chip for achieving that. Now, I know I've said this before, I'm not much of a gambler. but I know enough about gambling that you don't put things on the table that you're not willing to lose. And I don't think that we can afford to lose New START. So the treaty's extension should be a priority not for next year, but for today. Now, broadening out, I agree that we need to start thinking about constraining arms control or arms in a multipolar world. But that doesn't mean we necessarily get new countries into arms control agreements or specifically arms reduction treaties overnight. And it also doesn't mean just going after treaties. The first step towards multilateral arms control can actually be a little less grand. In fact, it can be as simple as reaffirming or establishing common understandings on a series of nuclear risk reduction measures, really starting with the 5 nuclear weapons states recognized under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, also known as the P5. Vince touched on this already a little bit. There's no doubt that members of the P5 have big problems and disagreements right now. They're basic fundamentals on which they can all agree. And by focusing on that common ground, it becomes clear that some of the disagreements about the future of arms control are about process and not necessarily about principles. Many common understandings have already been established in various P5 statements over the years. Given the rising nuclear tensions around the world, reiterating those common understandings and then explaining in detail why there is agreement on those particular understandings is timely and I think necessary. The process of creating mutually acceptable, fulsome explanations would be a confidence-building process in and of itself. To begin, the P5 could state or reiterate or explain their support for the following statements. A nuclear war can never be won, so must never be fought. We intend to extend the 74 years of non-use of nuclear weapons forever. We are committed to the long-term health of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and acknowledge that more progress must be made under the Article 6 commitment to disarmament. And the last one here, if we believe a nuclear exchange with another member of the P5 is imminent, we will immediately consult with that member. This would be the first step in creating something like a multilateral version of the 1973 Prevention of Nuclear War Agreement. Perhaps with affirmations like these in place, members of the P5 could encourage other nuclear-armed states like India and Pakistan to engage in a similar dialogue. Of course, none of these statements would fundamentally change policy, but their reiteration and re-emphasis can serve to lay a better foundation for more substantive conversations on multilateral arms control. For such discussions, we should remember that not all nuclear weapons states have spent the last 50 years engaging in arms control negotiations and dialogues. Instead of trying to create a new way to rope those countries in, perhaps we can actually look at our past. For example, the P5 could and should talk about the 1972 Strategic Arms Limitations talks and how those negotiations, subsequent agreements, and the lessons learned from them can be applied today. President Richard Nixon referred to SALT I as, quote, the beginning of a process that is enormously important that will limit now and we hope later reduce the burden of arms and thereby reducing the danger of war, end quote. It's hard to imagine a more apt description for what needs to be happening today among the P5. At the same time, standing efforts like the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification should be supported and expanded. As Ambassador Lehman mentioned, we can't get our arms around things like non-strategic nuclear weapons unless we have verification methods that can focus on warheads and not just delivery systems for the purposes of verification. New dialogue needs to be created to address the connection between nuclear weapons and conventional weapons, UAVs, precision strike weapons, hypersonic weapons, ballistic missile defenses, and the connections between offense and defense, lethal autonomous systems, and artificial intelligence. Ad hoc Track 1.5 and Track 2 dialogues can also be formed to discuss the function of, or form and function of asymmetric arms control agreements. We also need to be looking at the implications of synthetic biology on strategic stability. That's actually a discussion that I think needs to be happening in forums such as these more often. Nuclear weapon states can also take steps to preclude concepts before they even really come into real consideration. For example, while it's unclear as to whether a country would ever emplace nuclear weapons on a fully autonomous delivery system, it's probably prudent that we have a discussion about whether or not we should think about the prohibition of such a deployment. In fact, there's a wealth of options to explore regarding what could be termed as preemptive arms control, actually trying to get in front of problems before they become a problem. This concept can be pursued not only by policymakers and government, but by academics, by independent experts. We really need to rebuild the intellectual capital in this field, and that means broadening the circles. In short, arms control can and will play a role in managing risks in the multipolar context, but we cannot box ourselves in on when and how to use arms control. It can take the form of treaties, as I said, of executive agreements, transparency, and confidence-building measures. Really need to get creative here. We have too many problems to solve to assume there's only one way to get at a problem. Building an arms control architecture for the 21st century will not be easy, but I'm a big believer in American grit and determination. We can lead, and when it comes to reducing nuclear threats, I think we have to lead. So I look forward to our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. And last but not least is Dr. Brian Chow. He's a physicist, a good friend, and long associated with the RAND Corporation. Brian?
First, I'd like to thank STRATCOM for inviting me here. It is also my pleasure to be in this panel because it is moderated by Ambassador Lehman, who easily, to me, is the most accomplished negotiator for strategic arms control. 3 months ago, General Hyten said that Russia and China are building on-orbit weapons, in essence, kamikaze or suicide satellites. So this is not the 2007, direct ascent. These satellites can ram into American satellites. Indeed, in the next several years, China and Russia are going to deploy dual-use robotic spacecraft. On the one hand, these robotic spacecraft will perform important peaceful missions, such as removing space debris or repairing other satellites already in orbit. On the other hand, satellites can also, this kind of satellite can be readily switched to become kamikaze satellite or use their robotic arms to disable our satellite without generating much space debris. So 2 days ago, Defense One published my article online about how to deter and defend against this kamikaze or robotic threat. So I think in my initial statement, I like to focus on this threat. I have also done work on space arm control in general, so if you are interested, I'll be glad to give you the reference. But for now, I want to focus on this particular one that General Hyten is very concerned about and is not getting enough attention. So in the past, Russia and China have been leading the charge in the international community to pursue space arms control, but without success. Now, Article 2 of their treaty proposal says that states, parties to this treaty, shall not place any weapon in outer space. But since I talk about the robotic threat, they can essentially space weapons. So I believe the world needs to replace the impossible dream of no weapon in space with a practical approach of how to have a prosperous and peaceful space in the presence of at least some weapons. Now, last year, President Trump offered 2 ideas that I believe can make space arms control effective. The first one is the Space Policy Directive 3, calls individual spacecraft to safely pass near our satellites without hurting them. So this safe passage can be done by creating safety zones around these critical but vulnerable satellites that one wants to protect. The zone doesn't have to be large, like 50 kilometer geosynchronous, that's very small, so it doesn't affect the normal traffic. So that is to say, without prior consent, no country can enter another country's safety zone. I know you guys will have a lot of questions, but this is the last session and I'm the last panelist. So I want to say something specific so you can jump on me to get some excitement. Okay. So the second one is the American First National Space Strategy declared, if deterrence fails, we will counter threats. Countering threats is very important because activating defense after an attack has already occurred would be too late to save the attack satellite. So if we lose one early warning satellite, it really doesn't make sense to talk about, what do our response. The best way is how to save it. So the idea is that once an adversary's robotic spacecraft has entered a safety zone, and even though it has yet to attack, what we need to do is to maneuver a nearby bodyguard satellite already in the zone between our satellite and the invader. It's just in between. Now the thing in between the bodyguard doesn't even attack, just to have to block it. So in a sense, it's really a very proportional response. So I think interestingly, not only will safety zone and self-defense protect our satellites and deter the kamikaze and robotic attacks that General Hayden talked about, but these two measures also answer all the framing questions like Alex talked about, that the organizer of this measure, of this symposium, asked us panelists to answer. So here are my answers for those 4 questions. Yes, space is the domain in which arms control is applicable. Second, yes, safe zones are observable and violations are verifiable. So that's what Admiral Scholl said. It's very important to be verifiable and transparent. The third one is this safe zone agreement should eventually be multilateral. The fourth one is a formal safety zone agreement, including Russia and China, is highly preferred. Now, I know you guys say, well, what if they don't agree? So we can talk more about that during the discussion. But the point is, even if they refuse to join this agreement, I think the United States will need to have such an agreement with other Western countries and whatever else wants to join. Now, of course, you would say, why would that make the Russian and China want to join? So if that's your question, we can also discuss during the discussion. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Brian. We have about 35 minutes. We have a hard stop, but I think we've already rung the bell on numbers of questions coming in. But keep them coming in. I'll try to consolidate them. Some are for individuals, some are more general. Let me give you some of the general ones first, and I'll let the panel members decide if they want to answer the question. Everybody should feel free. What does it mean for arms control and other international norms when state actors use chemical weapons that are covered by the Chemical Weapons Convention to assassinate individuals in other countries? And is somebody trying to tell somebody something? Anybody want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I will. I actually have been a bit disappointed at some countries' reactions to Russia's use of a chemical agent in the UK and also Syria's continued use of chemical weapons against their own people. And I think that's because there's a huge group of countries out there that have been really pushing harder for disarmament, for more progress in this domain, specifically in the form of the Nuclear Ban Treaty. And a lot of those same countries have been suspiciously silent at the OPCW when talking about these threats, the Chemical Weapons Convention. That particular treaty really is the model for what we're going for an overall ban on a particular kind of weapon. It both had the right idea in place and the right goal, as well as a verification regime that was created in concert with the with industry types who actually bought into the verification regime, which is entirely necessary for making that treaty work. This is the sort of aspirational place we want all treaties to go, and threats to the CWC actually threaten the entire regime. So I'd really like to see the international community working a little bit harder to both, create penalties for the countries that violate the CWC, and also ways to mitigate further violations of that agreement.
Another general question that came from the audience. If nuclear weapons are now more salient to the nuclear weapon states, and other states that are in troubled regions are either acquiring them or threatening to acquire them, reading DPRK and Iran, what are the prospects of further proliferation, especially among our allies in this uncertain world? Anybody want that?
Sure. I mean, I think that's, we have a number of policy tools we rely on to try and prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, and it obviously matters a lot which country we're talking about. So North Korea's incentives for developing nuclear weapons over a long period of time are very different than a U.S. ally's incentives would be, and I am much more confident in our ability to influence our allies' incentives and persuade them that acquiring nuclear weapons is not going to be in their best interest or in the best interest of the alliances and the best interests of international security.
I would say just two things there. When people use the phrase countries like Iran and North Korea, there are no other countries like Iran and North Korea. They are sort of the problem state, and the NPT, which I talked a little bit about. Before that treaty was formed, there was a concern that there would be 30, 40, 50 nuclear weapons states. The fact that we're, where we are is, it's imperfect, but it has by and large been working, and we have these two kind of gaping wounds in the NPT, which are Iran and North Korea, and we're doing our best to work and fix those. If we think that there are other countries going down that road, it's upon us, the United States and our allies, to sort of push against it, get in front of it. But the second point there is non-proliferation is never over. It's a hard thing to sell politically. It's expensive. Being good at non-proliferation means nothing is happening, sure. And it's hard to go home and say, guess what, nothing happened today, and that's because of what I was doing. And but nevertheless, it's something that we need to continually be pushing on. We never get to stop working on non-proliferation.
A majority of the states of the United Nations have supported the prohibition of nuclear weapons. But most of the people in the world live in countries that have nuclear weapons on their soil, and a sizable number other live under a nuclear umbrella. Are we seeing the polarization of the world? And does this mean possibly the breakup of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has nearly everybody as a member?
Well, so the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is certainly a challenge to the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And to me, it underscores the need for the United States to have a kind of compelling and comprehensible nuclear risk reduction strategy that our allies can sign on to, and that the non-aligned members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty can sign on to. And I close my remarks by saying, for a number of reasons, unbounded competition wouldn't serve our interests, and I think that's one of them. If we're trying to sort of marshal the international community to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and the further spread of nuclear weapons, it's really important that we're willing to identify the limits and diplomatic mechanisms that restrain us as well, right? So, I mean, I think that's sort of my, Alex talked about a practitioner approach. That's kind of my practitioner-based answer to that question.
Yeah, I think the nuclear ban treaty didn't just pop out of the ephemera. This has been a frustration among non-nuclear weapon states that's been building for a while. And some of that does have to do with the fact that nuclear weapon states put a lot of commitments on the table in 1995 in order to secure the indefinite extension of the NPT. Some of those commitment chickens are coming home to roost, and we don't have a lot to show for it. And if we want to push back against something like a ban treaty, that doesn't have any formal verification mechanisms, that has become a very divisive subject, we're going to have to work harder on fulfilling some of the disarmament commitments that were put out there, 20 years ago, and a lot of that goes into what I was saying. It might not be easy to all of a sudden get a multilateral treaty, but I don't think that anybody can say that all members of the P5 are really working, as the MPT describes, in good faith on disarmament measures.
But on the other hand, I think if we don't handle North Korea and Iran, the situation well, I mean, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Saudi Arabia, all these countries can break loose through maybe their civilian nuclear program. They go for reprocessing and so forth. So there's really a danger there.
Well, picking up on that, many of our closest friends believe that the JCPOA with the nuclear agreement with Iran was essential to sustaining non-proliferation and buying time into the future. On the other hand, for many people, the model is the agreed framework on North Korea, which ultimately kicked the can until North Korea acquired a nuclear weapon. How do we compare our strategies on both in trying to engage versus permitting programs to continue?
Permitting programs, for me, like the civilian nuclear program, I think we can support the nuclear program, but certainly not reprocessing or enrichment.
I think we learned a lot of lessons from the agreed framework, and a lot of those lessons were applied to the JCPOA negotiations and trying to make that's why you had this exceptionally large document really getting into details and loopholes that could arise, trying to account for the failures of the agreed framework. But there's no right way to do any of this, and there's sort of never a way to create a perfect agreement. You create an agreement that is good, that is solid, that is verifiable, where all parties feel like they're getting something from it. But you don't just get to wipe your hands and say, whew, glad that's done, and go on to the next thing. You have to constantly tend that agreement and make adjustments where necessary. Again, it's a case of having to sort of work on this forever, which is not always the most fun thing to do, but when it comes to sort of managing these threats, it's what we have to do.
The Senate had conditions for the ratification of New START involving non-strategic systems, and the issue continues to be raised about other countries and other parties. When does one address the conditions raised by the Senate?
So I think the case of Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons it's important. I certainly don't think anything in those documents said we shouldn't extend the treaty unless we somehow got an amendment to include limits on Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons. It's certainly something that I think we should have a goal of trying to limit those systems in a follow-on agreement. But I would also add that we could have limits on those systems today, and that would perhaps give us some better transparency into those forces. It would give us maybe some confidence that the disparity in U.S. and Russian non-strategic systems isn't going to grow. But the deterrence challenge that's identified in the 2018 nuclear posture, for instance, relative to Russia, which is really limited nuclear use and coercion, isn't going to be solved by an arms control agreement, right? It's going to be solved by having a set of forces and a deterrence strategies that you're confident in, and perhaps then having a diplomatic tract or a risk reduction tract where you think you are conveying that and hopefully changing what you view as Russian views on the potential benefits of going nuclear earlier in a conflict than we would hope. And so I think limiting those systems is valuable, but it's not necessarily the silver bullet that I think some people are portraying it as.
How should arms control deal with systems such as hypersonic boost glide vehicles and other hypersonic vehicles, which in some cases escaped previous treaties because of legal loopholes?
Well, I mean, there weren't loopholes if those systems didn't exist at the time, right? And I mean, we specifically negotiated the
Yes, they did.
The hypersonic boost glide systems did not, and we specifically negotiated the New START treaty so that such systems, at least if they weren't carrying a nuclear weapon, wouldn't count against the treaty limits, right? So my sense is that the Russian avant-garde system, if it is deployed within the life of New START, would count against the treaty limits. Some of these other exotic systems that Vladimir Putin talked about in early 2018, I think I would like to see those captured under limitations or at least some kind of transparency regime. On the other hand, I don't know if I would be willing to walk away from the entire strategic arms control framework at this time simply because they're not counted or limited, because they're not operational systems yet, right? I mean, right now, the New START framework does set limits on Russian strategic range systems, and we have every reason to believe that ballistic missiles will continue to be sort of the mainstay of Russian strategic nuclear forces into the future. So I'm pretty happy having limits on those things. I would not want to be in a situation where my inability to get verifiable limits on the 1% or less of Russian strategic systems causes me to lose verification and limits on the 99%.
Ron, I think I'd just like to state that we would like to see, as new technologies develop that have the capability to deliver, that is inside of an arms control agreement. That said, these are some of the challenges that we'll see in the 21st century, where we have our ability to go through the treaty, and it's not that the treaties are stagnant, but how do you create the dynamics inside of agreements that allow for adjustments and both verification regimes, confidence building measures, as well as the expansion of systems so that we don't see maneuvers around legal details of the agreement, and producing technologies at the rate that we're producing today, and certainly this applies outside of what I'll call the physical and inside of cyber, and even to a certain extent space, where you have the ability to drive technology to move faster than, say, the paperwork of agreements and the timelines, and the ability to make changes to really, as you know from your history, how long it takes to get to an agreement.
Just for the record, when we were negotiating START 1, I think our inclination was to handle hypersonic boost glide vehicles and similar vehicles as if they were sort of an exotic MARV. So they would still count, if they were on an ICBM, they were just like another warhead. At the time, most of the focus was on intercontinental range or strategic of some sort. Nobody was really heavily focused on IRBM hypersonics. And so this actually didn't get dealt with in INF. The result is that the INF definitions of a ballistic missile and a cruise missile leave another category. And that's where the hypersonics fit in. But in finishing up START 1, the decision was made that just to make it easy, because we had already agreed to it in INF, we used the INF definition in START. So the so-called loophole, or I mean, we knew what it was there, exists now in both treaties.
I think it's important, though, if you go back to that Putin, Steve Jobs with nuclear weapons presentation, he really did talk about it in terms of what are these for, and posited it as a way to get around what they see as increasingly capable U.S. ballistic missile defenses. So yes, I think we need to talk with them about getting those systems under a arms control regime, but we're going to have to be ready for their response, which is, okay, we want to talk about ballistic missile defense. Are we ready to put that on the table in a way that we're comfortable with, that's politically palatable? It's not simply we want Russia to do something. They're going to want us to do something too. That's how arms control works. So when it comes to those new systems, which, as Vince mentioned, might not even come online until after New START has expired with a 5-year extension, we're going to have internal conversations about BMD.
Question. How should we deal with conventional arms if they are on the same delivery vehicles as nuclear weapons, or if they can perform the targeting missions that were once done by nuclear weapons?
Sure. So I think we haven't talked much about China. I'll get to the dual capable issue in a moment. But I mean, I think China is the area where thinking how we can adapt our approach to arms control in some way that constrains and gives us more transparency into China's conventional strike forces in the Asia Pacific would be very valuable. And I don't think we have the answer to that yet. And it's not entirely clear what exactly we want or what exactly we would be willing to put on the table to get some kind of limitation there. And the standard of verification, I think, would, at least at the outset, would probably be different than what we're accustomed to. But that's an important issue to think through. Now, I think if a system meets the definitions under New START, it would count against the treaty limits, regardless of whether it has a conventional or a nuclear warhead on it. And then it gets more complicated with dual capable or dual variant delivery vehicles that are theater range. And that will be a big challenge if we do get a treaty that constrains non-strategic nuclear weapons in some way, where I think you'd probably have to focus on the warheads, and you might not be able to limit the delivery vehicles because it's going to be too hard to distinguish between ones with conventional mission and ones with a nuclear one. But that's some initial thoughts.
So I agree with Vince. I mean, you either control the vehicle or the missile itself, or you defend against it. So those are the two ways.
Question. In post-New START, how many nuclear-armed countries need to be at the table? And do any non-nuclear armed countries need to be at the table?
I think a lot of folks have talked about this in terms of you still have the United States and Russia with 90% of the world's nuclear weapons at 1,550 deployed. Some people posit that maybe there's one more agreement that the U.S. and Russia have to do before countries like China will be ready to come to the table to get down to about 1,000 deployed warheads, and maybe then they'll start talking. But again, as I mentioned in my remarks, I don't think that necessarily starts with other countries joining a reduction treaty. We can be starting the work now to get countries a little bit accustomed to the process, and that really goes back to the beginning of how did we and the Soviet Union start in the first place. And it's complex, persistent, sort of tedious conversations about each other's postures and forces, and we could be doing that now, long before we actually get to the actual text of an agreement. It sometimes gets sort of tossed aside as sort of a non-accomplishment, but the P5 have been working on a glossary, and it usually gets some laughs, and who cares about that? But coming to shared definitions of nuclear terms among countries with 4 different native languages, I think is important. We need that kind of common understanding to form the treaties we want. So it's little steps like that can be happening now.
But it seems the number too far. Even go down to 1,000. 1,000 is still a lot more than a couple hundred. So
true, very true. But I think.
So I don't know how. Is that a way that that they get? What benefit do they get? If they are willing to reduce from the 200 to 100. So they must induce them to have that.
Brian offered some initiatives in space arms control. Does anybody have any initiatives in cyber arms control?
Well, so I do think that's an area where something focusing on conduct and trying to clarify perceptions of actions and consequences of actions, rather than focusing on the systems themselves, might be fruitful. So if we had a clear understanding between U.S., Russian, and Chinese leaders that a big cyber attack on critical infrastructure would be hugely escalatory, that would be valuable. That would sort of reinforce the deterrence relationship. There'd, of course, be policy judgments and questions about whether probing and putting malicious software on some of these networks is consistent with that agreement or not. I would actually argue it actually is consistent with a mutual deterrence relationship. But I think that's an area where trying to limit the weapon systems themselves is going to be very, very difficult and we probably, I don't know if it will ever be in a situation to do that, but for now, I think just trying to clarify what we're capable of doing and how we perceive those types of actions is a good starting point.
I just want to add a point that cyber and space, they are highly connected. You know, we're not talking about two countries, three countries, you know, China, Russia, and USA, not even counting other countries. So let's assume that China is able to hijack a Russian or even a US satellite to attack another US early warning satellite. The situation will be very complicated because with hijack, you may not be able to do the attribution. So it affects the deterrence policy, it affects the second strike and all kinds of things. So that's a tremendous problem. So if we want to solve the space problem, we have to solve the cyber attack issue at the same time.
Ron, I think from the standpoint, I'm excited to see, from the earlier panel with the Academic Alliance, the depth of thought that they put into some of these things that are really hard for, and a little bit of age just shows that I don't really know how to use a lot of the different systems and things that they talk about. And it is developed at a level in the intangible that they understand completely. And it doesn't sit in my head. I think of tangible one-for-one in a numbers game. It's math. When we talk about a deterrence equation, that's easy for me to put together and understand it. But I think cyber is very different because you're going to talk about if we do come to an agreement, is there a latency and a grandfather clause for something that was put out there before that that then takes effect later? And those are the things that our younger generation, I think more broadly about and have a depth of knowledge inside of it that's able to apply it. And we have to leverage some of that thought and development to be able to create things that will be effective today and effective broadly going across into the future, right? Without getting into the problems of, you know, the guy in his t-shirt in the basement that's a contractor that's subcontracted through another agent that works for some governmental activity. How do you, I like the attribution standpoint of it, but it really is getting into the understanding of how that can be applied. And then from an operator standpoint, and again, I don't quite understand it, how do you have verification and how do you have limitations that go into things that are intangible? It is really difficult. I can at least see into space. I can at least see the numbers that are out there. I can't see that in terms of what's going on in cyber. And there are big challenges in that realm, but I think we have really smart individuals, and I think together, this is where alliances work together to create what would be needed to provide the norms and rules of behavior. Once that is solidified, then we can get into a broader discussion of what would be an effective agreement towards, and I don't even know, Mike, if you think of it as arms control. I know we think of it as effects generation and weapons, but how do you deal with that as an arm in an agreement? I'm just not certain with that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody heard it, but the J5 at the Cybercom just mentioned that there's really no incentive to bring everybody to the table to drive norms of behavior because they all feel like they have an advantage and they want to hold on to that advantage without limiting their capabilities.
A lot of that comes, though, from as far as what's the drive, what brings people to the table. That does require leadership. The previous administration decided they wanted to get leader-level attention to the issue of nuclear security, to locking down fissile material sources around the world, and was able to 4 times, get 40 plus heads of state together to talk about a relatively small part of the international security space, but was able to actually get through not only treaty mechanisms, but a lot of norms and understandings about these issues. So it really, there has to be a will to do it.
I thought about your problem in the space arena, how to get China and Russia to get in. Now in space, I think the way to go would be for the U.S. starting with the Western country to set up some kind of keep-out zones through the space traffic management. Okay, so we set up, if we want to do business with the Western country, this is the way we do. And I look at, in the past and also in the next 20 years, U.S. especially, plus the West has the lion's share. I mean, the China and Russia, they are really in bad shape in terms of technology and so forth. All you heard about is their launch, but launch only counts like 2% of the space industry market. So the point is that if U.S. and the Western countries set up some space traffic management, if you want to do business with us, you have to observe the zones. And then the only way they can go to gain more of the market, because the space industry market is going from $330 billion now to $1 trillion in 20 years. So for them to participate in the car, the only way they can do is to join partnership with the Western countries, which the Soviets already, the Russian is already doing that with the Proton and so forth. So they do that, so they have to fall in line with the policy that we set up. So that the commercial market is the incentive to make them to join us. So we must go that way, as opposed to formulate, let's have a meeting, everybody, they won't agree to it.
The State Department compliance report lists a long list of Russian violations of arms control agreements. If we go ahead with new agreements, what should we be doing with respect to the violations that exist?
I worked for many years on the compliance report. That was super fun. It's difficult sometimes to be in the position of the grown-up in the room. And I've said this to Russians before, so I don't feel bad about offending them here. They do have a tendency to push at the edges of some of these agreements, but quite frankly, I'd don't like to throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. Some of our concerns about the Biological Weapons Convention have to do with reporting that they sort of put out and then retracted. That's a problem, and I do think there should be a full accounting of the former Soviet bioweapons program, but I don't think it's a reason to leave the Biological Weapons Convention. We need to sort of deal with the fact that, sometimes it's the nature of countries to want to try to push at the edges, but again, I'd rather have a country inside of a box straining to get out than completely free of the box doing whatever they want. So it's in our interest to have Russia and all these countries in these agreements. It's in our interest to continue to find ways to make them work better, to clear out loopholes. It's frustrating, but we want these agreements. We don't want countries to be completely unfettered to do whatever they want with any weapon, anytime.
Final question, because I think we need to go to Admiral Creedy. In the START negotiations, the initial Soviet position was that the United States had to compensate the Soviets for the British and French forces. If we go into multinational negotiations on nuclear arms with the Chinese and the Russians, will the model be a block model or something like the Washington naval treaties? Will it be sides, or will each have a quota? How would this be approached?
I mean, it's a great question. When we could say that the upper limit is U.S.-Russian forces at whatever they agree upon in this new multilateral regime that we're spelling out, and everyone has to stay underneath it, in which case it would be pretty easy for China, the UK, and France to stay well underneath those limits, or you could have some kind of a more tailored, customized approach where each country agrees to a specific limit and they're all different, right? maybe the United States and Russia are the same, or maybe even the United States and Russia are different, and then you have different limits for these smaller nuclear weapon states. If you were able to get into that model, I think it's a good question. But
Yeah, Ambassador, I don't really have a solution right now, but it's a high-class problem that I would be very excited to deal with, given the opportunity.
There is a secret history here. In the START negotiations, I had probably 1,000 different ways to say "niet" to our Soviet colleagues. But in one weak moment, I must now confess in public, I did say to my Soviet colleague that we were prepared, at least I was prepared, to compensate them for the British if they would compensate us for the French. I think we've run out of time, and so join me in thanking this excellent panel.